Good morning again. Today's discussion is on Chapter 3, Equilibrium Analysis in Economics. You can follow the discussion on uh, Chapter 3 in Chang's and Rainwright's book. Right, let's begin. Now, when we think of, aside from the one indicated here, which we'll be discussing in a short while, what first comes into mind pag we encounter the word in equilibrium? Anyone? What first comes into mind? Yes, Kahupam, I'll call you. Uh, when you hear the word equilibrium, what first comes into mind?
I think po balance,
There's a balance. A balance of what?
variables.
Variables. Okay, thank you. Also, Kahukam said the same thing, balance. Now, uh, Chang and Rainwright highlighted that we mentioned about equilibrium. So it's a constellation of selected interrelated variables so adjusted to one another that no inherent tendency to change prevails in the model which they constitute. Now, take notice on those three terms, selected, interrelated, and also inherent. So, pag sinasabi nating selected, uh, the equilibrium under condition can only have significance and relevance only in the context of the particular set of the variables that is chosen, meaning that the equilibrium condition that we set and those study is only significant or is only it's only relevant when we establish a form of variables included in the model. So only in those study, only using those variables with that equilibrium condition would be significant in the analysis. When we also, if for example, if we include other variables into that equilibrium state, then that equilibrium state would no longer apply kasi nga magbabago yung equilibrium state because of the additional variables. Second, when we talk about interrelated variables, it would mean to say that all the variables that we're studying in the model, they would be they should be simultaneously be in a state of rest. So ika nga, you have a balance when all the variables are compatible, when all the variables have already adjusted in terms of its relationship with the other variable. So it doesn't mean this relationship being established might be direct or indirect, but what is important is that the variables on hand or the variables on study are at rest. The third one is that there's no inherent tendency to change. It means to say that, again, in terms of balance of the internal forces of the model, we assume that the other external forces are fixed, meaning, ika nga sa economics, when we're studying, we would say that we held other things constant, meaning that there could be other variables that are again exogenous to the model, but might somehow influence the model. But then again, we are not allowing that influence to be significant into that equilibrium state. Okay, so if we're only studying about the price and quantity, for example, the law of demand, where if only establishing that the price and quantity relationship between the commodity in that model, then there could have other factors that could have an effect with that, but we're not accommodating those. Kasi nga, we are restricting only the variables of price and quantity to work on that model. Okay. So again, when we talk about equilibrium, there is that balance of internal forces, and that balance would tell us to also have restrictions. So it's important to have restrictions, assumptions, in the economic model in order to come up with an equilibrium state. The equilibrium state that we're referring in this class, no, in this chapter rather, we are referring to that as static. So there is, again, there is, we are in simpler term, parang a snapshot of an equilibrium state, because that snapshot is more of less just looking at it at one point in time. Kasi it is possible that perhaps in the same variables under study, the variables could change eventually, and with that there is that dynamics already. So when you compare two equilibrium state, you call that comparative statics. Or we are now referring to the static being dynamic. So again, equilibrium state that we are studying right now is statics. Pag sasabihin natin statics, we're looking at an equilibrium state at what point in time. All right, now let's use the slide here. Also, when the notion of equilibrium tells us two equilibrium types or distinctions, it could be goal equilibrium or non-goal equilibrium. But goal equilibrium, there is that market outcome. It's a desirable state. It's a desirable market outcome for an ideal economy. Example, the basic supply and demand model. So in that equilibrium, if we solve for that equilibrium value for that supply and demand model, then we would arrive with a solution value, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, that are ideal for both buyers and sellers. That is again essential for them to do an exchange in the market. So that's ideal, or they're desirable. However, there's also another type that is considered as not desirable. Not desirable kasi it is still an equilibrium condition. However, we mostly want to work to shy away from it kasi the outcome is not desirable. Example, underemployment. There's also a condition that an equilibrium that moves underemployment to that state. So again, by the idea, by the concept of underemployment, uh, it is something that policymakers don't have any desired state for that. But again, due to some forces, it does move to a certain state. There's also an equilibrium condition or an equilibrium on externalities. Perhaps when we talk about the externalities, I think this is referring mostly on negative externality. So if we talk about negative externality, it is something that we doesn't really like. It's not a desirable state because again, it's just a third. It's receiving this cost. So most of the negative externalities that we're dealing are mostly cost. So we don't really like cost. So in terms of that, what else? Now, since we're dealing with equilibrium, there's also the concept of disequilibrium. So pag sasabihin natin disequilibrium, that tells us na, again, quite contradictory already. The variables are not in state, are not compatible. So it means to say that if we have an equilibrium price and quantity in a supply and demand market model, then this equilibrium refers to excesses or um, uh, referred to as shortage and surplus. So again, equilibrium conditions tells us that there is equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. This equilibrium tells us that there is excess shortage and there is shortage and there's also surplus. Okay. Now, if there is no other restrictions that are made in the market, then if you're in a disequilibrium state, the market forces will move prices up or down depending on depending on some circumstances. It would always move to a state of equilibrium. Okay? So, kunyari, if there is a shortage in the market, eventually the market will will try to move the prices up to the equilibrium. If there's a surplus, so pag sasabihin nating surplus, primarily, mataas yung presyo, di ba? So kung mataas yung presyo, uh, consumers would not buy a lot of those goods kasi nga mataas. So it is possible na madaming supply ng good na yon. So in order to move back the equilibrium, market forces would push the prices down. So that is again left to the forces in the market. Now, for now, we'll just take it as a given. Ano yung mga forces na yun? But again, as what Smith would tell us, can these are market forces work in place? Let's go to 3.2, partial market equilibrium in a linear model. So when we say about partial market, partial, there's only one price, one quantity. We're only dealing with one commodity. Okay. Now, there's four important things to remember when you're dealing with a partial market equilibrium. First is that we how to construct the model. The second is uh, how to obtain the solution values. So this is primarily the process already. How to solve linear functions, how to solve quadratic, cubic, and such. And third one would be how to write this one in set notation. And lastly, which should be the important part here, but I think I failed to write, this would be the analysis part already. Okay, how do we interpret price and quantity? Again, so pag we are solving in either partial or general market equilibrium, four things to remember: how to construct the model, how to obtain the solution value, how to write it in set notation, and lastly, what would be the economic interpretation that we provide when we have the values already. Okay, let's start first in constructing the model. Now, we're first dealing with the basic supply and demand model, so we'll have to review a lot of our terms here that we've learned in Econ 102. So in this one commodity model, or I can perhaps interchangeably use one good or one commodity. Either way, it's just the same. So in a one commodity model, there are two variables. So two variables kasi we can just try to eliminate this or try to equate this one into equal to Q. Okay. So with this, we have these variables here. We have QD. QD stands for quantity demand, QS quantity supplied, and we also have price here. Other than determining which is what we're trying to determine or what we're trying to solve, what we're looking for, which is price and quantity, we also need to establish a form of assumptions. Now, these assumptions, class, are important because these are the theoretical basis of the model. And so it would guide us later on the economic analysis part. So the equilibrium condition tells us that there would be no shortage. There was also no surplus. That is to say, QD minus QS should be equal to zero. If this state is present, then we are confident to say that the market is cleared. Again, so when we have market, if there is market clearing if the market class again is cleared, there is no again shortage or surplus. Okay, let's also discuss the framework that are present here. We have the law of demand and we also have the law of supply. So as a review, when you have a law of demand, if tataas yung presyo, QD would also decrease. That is to say, if talagang mataas yung presyo or if tataas yung presyo, not to mention the elasticity or the responsiveness of consumers here, it is by theory, consumers would decrease their consumption of one good. Okay, and what we have established before is that they have this negative relationship. It's an inverse relationship. Okay, as one increases, the other would decreases ceteris paribus. We are holding other things constant. And therefore, when you graph, we have a decreasing linear function. Okay. So let's have a relatable experience class. What good recently na tumaas yung presyo and then as expected, your response is you decrease your consumption of that good. Anyone? Going back to the discussion, now let's discuss about the law of supply. So again, we've established also before that they have a direct relationship. So tataas yung presyo, tataas din yung consumption, yung production ng good because the price here serves as a signal for producers to produce more of that good. And so that would be postulated to be an increasing linear function. Uh, Now, when translated class into mathematical statements, um, which would be the focus of the chapter, would be the model can be written as this way here. Okay, so again, we'll have to go back with our theoretical basis to form with this mathematical statement, indicating that this would be our equilibrium condition. Let's also look at the parameters class. So we have 4 parameters here, and we will be specifying this restriction that they should be positive values. Oftentimes, in other sections of the text, we will be dealing with some non-negative values. But I suppose in this model, will only restrict na dapat positive yung values ng parameters. Okay? Uh, all right. Let's also look at the parameters here. What A is, what B or negative C or D is. So when we have A in the demand function, that would be the intercept. That would mean to say that that would be the quantity that consumers would want to buy if the price of the product were equal to 0. We also have negative p there. That would be the slope of the demand curve. That would be the coefficient on the price in the slope. So what does that tells us? The economic interpretation for that would be for every 1 unit increase in price, the quantity falls by b units. Okay. We also have when looking at the supply function, we have negative c. That would be the intercept of the supply curve. So if you have that tells us na of course producers would not sell anything if the price would be equal to 0. How much more if the price would be negative? So they wouldn't produce anything at all if they wouldn't it would not be economically feasible. We also have D there indicating that that is the slope, the supply curve, which is positive. Um, it is important na we're able to describe in we're able to describe what this equation would mean in words. Or what I mean to say is that we must somehow know how to explain the parameters in words. When we graph the demand and supply, the following can be analyzed. Take note, class, that this is quite different with the one that we're accustomed to, meaning that price here is our independent variable. Q here is our dependent variable. Kasi nga magkaiba mostly yung other economic text kasi baliktad yung pagkakagraph nila, which is uh, actually this example is the technically correct way to do it when you have the supply and demand functions. Okay. But take note, by convention, if you're comfortable with just with treating the other one as dependent or independent variable, you might want to know the distinction between how to use or when to use rather inverse demand function or the demand function itself. For this one, yung ginamit natin is directly yung supply and demand functions. Okay, so again, you could either solve or come up with equilibrium values either by solving it or by just using the a graphical analysis. Okay. Um, okay. So at this point, again, this is the intersection of the demand and supply functions. At this point, we have two elements. We have a set of ordered pairs where we have a equilibrium price, and we also have equilibrium quantity. Okay. So again, in this market, there is a state of balance, there is no tendency of change here. When the price glass is again above the equilibrium price, we meant to say that there is a surplus at that point. So if there is no other restrictions in the model, there would be market forces rather would push the prices down. Pag shortage naman, uh, sasabihin din na the price is below the equilibrium price. So what will happen? It will move back to the equilibrium state. So in our study for now, because we're dealing mostly with static analysis, we'll just look at it at one point in time. Okay. Okay. So, okay, I think. Now let's look at this. Now the next part would be how to solve or to obtain the solution values. Um, this is quite a lengthy explanation to that, but I think in terms of the process class, this is something that we're familiar with already. But we need first to understand what would be the condition that we have. So again, the condition tells us that we would be equating the two, leaving us the condition that quantity would be the same in either of those functions. Rewriting the model, we have again Q is equal to A negative BP, and also Q equal to negative C plus DP. We will need to reduce the model to two equations, which is again equating the two. We're now left with isolating P, and by that, we have P star that is entirely expressed in terms of the parameters that is given in the model. P here, as should be the case in economics, would indicate we have a positive value for P. So it's we have a positive price. Also, if we have P star already, we can go directly and solve for the equilibrium quantity by substituting it into either of the functions. And you will arrive with an answer which is equal to Q star equal to AD minus B over BC over P plus T. Now, take note, class, that the denominator here should be positive. In order for us to also arrive with a positive numerator in totality, then we have a positive Q star. Okay, so please take note of the restrictions. Aside from as aside from we need to have these positive values, we restrict these parameters to be positive. Then it should be noted that the numerator would be positive if and only if AD is greater than BC here. Okay, and aside from that, also the denominator would be positive. Okay. Okay. So now moving forward in writing set notation. So I think I will not go back to this one, but if there are no other restrictions that are made, so in terms of restrictions, this is possible when the market is not allowed to move to equilibrium state in conditions like price ceiling or price floor. Then if those restrictions are not met, then we are certain that the intersection of demand and supply will yield an equilibrium value equal to P star and Q star. Okay. All right. Do we have a question before we proceed?
None for me, ma'am.
All right. Now, here's a numerical example class, which you can do later. I think I provided a few examples, but the process, in terms of the process, you wouldn't be having a problem because we're only confronted with a simple linear function. When you have a linear function, you can either do a elimination or substitution method, and then you will surely arrive with a solution value because again, the complications in terms of parameters, hindi, you only have around 4 parameters, so there wouldn't be a problem to that. The only thing siguro that we will might come across in the problem of in obtaining a solution value is first is should we use a decimals or fractions to be uniform, let's just use fractions. And second would be what would be these values would not mean anything if there is no economic interpretation behind it. So the economic interpretation would be that this would be our equilibrium price, this would be our equilibrium quantity, indicating that in the market without restrictions, then this is the price that the price that both buyers and sellers agreed to exchange the quantity that is equal to this one. Okay. So right. Questions? None. All right. What else? So I'll go back to this one later class when we're dealing with national income analysis. But this is just one example of a linear function in income determination model. Okay, so for now, let's just stick muna with these examples. Okay, so let me just scan through my notes here. Baka I might have overlooked something. Okay. Let's go back to this one here. Okay, so in most cases, class, this is again the general parameters. In most cases, the idea is very similar to this one here. But it should be noted that again, both values for P star and Q star or the general solution should be in terms of parameters, or it should be expressed again in the values in those positive parameters A, B, C, and D. Okay. I would not encourage you to memorize uh uh this equilibrium value. I mean, I wouldn't encourage you to just memorize P star here and Q star, because later on class, um this this could change. Okay, so what am I saying? Bakit I don't want you to memorize? Kasi if you have numerical values, it is possible that you can just plug in the values in the formula here kasi this is considered as a formula already. And if you have numerical examples, you can go ahead and just go ahead. You can go ahead and then plug the numbers here. But I don't again encourage you to do so because the functions here could change. Okay, so it would be best to have this one as a guide, but just don't memorize it, or don't memorize it na lang. Okay, because again it could change. But if the organization or the function is just the same, you can just plug in the values. What else? There's also cases, class, that although I would not be using here that in my text, but it is somehow possible that the equilibrium quantity might not be actually positive. So to guide you siguro on understanding, always go back to the restrictions being made in the model, or the or if not the restrictions, the assumptions of the model. Okay. It's also possible, class, that the equilibrium quantity would be zero, or if the at that market, it's possible that producers would not produce anything at all. Okay, so but then again, you will arrive to that idea if if you're following the restrictions or the assumptions being made here. Okay. I suppose that is straightforward. So there's no if there's no other clarifications, let's go to the how to solve partial market equilibrium in a nonlinear model. So again, if you have a nonlinear model, you would possibly, by the words of one student, possibly attack a nonlinear model. By again, if it's quadratic, you use quadratic formula. If it's cubic, you could either use trial and error. If it's what else? If you have a set, if you have a higher degree polynomial, then of course you will be using you will be you will need another methodology to solve for successful candidates. But then again, the process would be somehow um, quite just similar to when you're dealing with those functions. Okay. Let's go through this example here. So suppose we have numeral coefficients in the form of quadratic functions. Uh, we have Again, we have a demand function. We also have supply function. We then try to reduce it to a single equation by elimination of variables. We can do so. We can try to reduce this one into one single equation because we have stated early on that equilibrium condition should be equal to both quantities. Okay, and with that we come up with equation equal to p squared plus 4p minus 5 is equal to 0. With this single equation, class, we know that first we can solve this one using quadratic formula, and second, we know that the roots would be referred to as price here because again, we only have one unknown, which is price. Okay. So when using the quadratic formula, we find the roots equal to p is equal to 1 or p is equal to -5. Now, it is very obvious, class, that in terms of economic feasibility, we only have positive values. But then again, if ibang model na to, tapos hindi natin kabisado yung theory, then it would be hard for us to distinguish which root we would be using. So for this example, it's understandable that the root that we'd be using would be p is equal to 5. No, sorry. P is equal to 1 kasi nga it's an economically admissible price. But then again, what I'm saying is that if you're not familiar really with economic theories, later on, when we're solving already, we're finding the equilibrium value of that code, baka magiging mahirap na siya kasi nga hindi tayo familiar sa theory. Okay? Good thing, what we have here is just a simple price and quantity determination. Okay? So for this one, we have ruled out that negative prices will not be included in the study. Okay? As just a practice, you can the functions here could also be written this way, and the intersection of this would be equal to this one. So again, class, bakit nga we have four elements here? Four elements kasi nga it is still in terms of the terms of the process of solving quadratic formulas, you'll have four elements or you have two ordered pairs because you have two roots. Um, then in this case, we know that this part of this first ordered set would be we will be accounting for in our study. Okay. So again, what would be the restriction class? So what would be, say for example, if we restrict only positive values here, we will rule out this ordered pair and we will only end up with one ordered pair. Okay? If there is no restrictions, sabihin natin no restrictions, if we are just strict on the quadratic formula and how it would yield some answers, then we'll yield with two elements. Okay? When graphing, then when we're graphing, then we will be somehow be having this form of uh, analysis. Okay, so there is this website that that we can use perhaps in the comprehensive final exam. I might be asking you to solve or to graph a nonlinear model. So there is what we call GeoGrapha. I hope you would be familiar with it already. I know that you're familiar with the graphing part because you have done that one in your earlier um, path subjects. But I think that it would also be best that our study here in this course would be accompanied with graphical analysis. So let's try to be comfortable with graphing every now and then the functions that we are studying in the course. Okay. So here's another example class. Again, still in the equilibrium price and quantity. We do have also, I think we're still dealing with a quadratic, yeah, a quadratic equation of for price and quantity in these functions. So again, um, we have a demand function here. We also have a supply function. We can reduce this using elimination method, or perhaps using the substitution method, or perhaps we just use the algebraic methods. Either way, you will be arriving with one single solution, or yes, one single equation, okay, which is equal to this one. And based on this one class, you have a one unknown, which is q. So you're certain that what you're looking for, the roots that you would be solving using quadratic formula, would yield a value for q. And with that, you will be confronted by this one here. Okay. Now, Miss Question, what if we have in this example, madaling sabihin kasi nga negative yung value. Okay? Tapos you would know, okay, price is equal to 1 yung answer. How about if positive yung both values ng P or positive yung both values ng 3? Ay, no. Positive yung both values ng Q. Paano ba natin malalaman na anong quantity, ano talaga yung equilibrium price and quantity? Is there an answer from my class?
Ma'am.
Yes, Estrada?
Ma'am, I'll have a guess.
Yeah,
I'm
go
not
ahead.
really sure. Ma'am, but I think the best way to know if the answer that if the answer would be Q1 or Q2 or P1 or P2 is to substitute the values to the original functions so that we could see if it makes sense.
All right, very good. So of course we do we usually do what we usually do. We try to check it and if they would yield an inequality. Okay, so very good. Now before we proceed to the general market equilibrium class, do we have a question about partial market equilibrium? Siguro in terms of differences, there's not much difference, class, in terms of partial and general market. But the general market is more on how would one commodity, what would be there is these terms of interdependencies because we will be establishing whether these goods are complementary or substitute goods. But before we go to that, do we have questions about the partial market equilibrium? Baka may nakalimutan tayo. Sige. I think before in my earlier class, we actually stop in partial market equilibrium. We will be allotting that discussion on general market on Friday. So for this class to be uniform, siguro we'll stop in partial market equilibrium, and instead let's discuss what will happen if the market is in this equilibrium para we can still extend our discussion later on price ceiling and price floor. Okay, so if there's no question to the first part of the discussion, let's move to what will happen if there is a disequilibrium. Again, we are still allowing the market here to move back to the equilibrium state. So there's still no government restrictions here. There's still no unintended consequences. Okay, so let's discuss first what is usually the case when there's excess supply. Okay, so when we have an excess supply, that tells us that there is more goods. There is the firms of the good. No, there's no there is still in terms of quantity, mas madaming quantity, mas madaming possibly the suppliers have produced more than expected in the market. And so in that case, one possible reason for that is that mataas yung presyo ng commodity na yon. So in our example here, okay, suppose we're done solving with the linear, we're done solving with the equilibrium condition or equilibrium value, and the equilibrium price is equal to 40, and the equilibrium quantity is equal to 1,000. So take note, Lasa, that I'm using here the inverse functions here kasi binaliktad ko yung price and quantity here. Okay, so this is actually by convention with some other economic texts. But anyway, we have equilibrium price equal to 40, equilibrium quantity equal to 1,000. So there is a surplus when the price is equal to 50. Mas mataas yung 50 kasi 40. So in that case, sasabihin ng mga consumers, tumaas yung presyo, I might be shying away, or I might consume less because again, tumaas yung presyo. This is still not concerning about the elasticity of the price of the good itself. What we are understanding is, again, mataas yung presyo, in theory, decrease the consumption. Okay. Now, in that case, suppliers are willing to provide or willing to sell 1,500 units of good X. Okay? O sasabihin ng supplier, we're very much willing to sell this much quantity, 1,500 quantity of goods X at the price of 50. On the side of the demanders and the side of consumers, because mataas yung presyo, they're only willing to purchase around they're only willing to purchase around 800 units of good X. So in that case, there is that surplus of 700 units of good X. So again, in terms of supply, there is an excess of that. And how will this market move back to the equilibrium state, which is again a price of 40, quantity of 1,000? That is, babaan natin yung presyo kasi nga, if that would be the case, then consumers will now be more encouraged to purchase more of that good. So again, if there is an excess supply, mataas yung presyo, how to move that back into the equilibrium? Babaan natin yung presyo. Okay? So in this case, what we have here is that we tried to get the values for this one. the values when we are in excess is that we just substitute also the price of 50 uh, equal to then the price of 50 here to either of the functions. Okay. So this is already yung parang distinctions class na we're treating price here as the independent variable and quantity as the dependent variable. So again, what I'm using right now is yung inverse demand and inverse supply. So baka magtaka kayo bakit ganito yung ano ko, yung parang how I outline the answers. But then again, this is quite the technical correct way of doing it, because we're treating here price as the independent variable here. Okay. Now, what happens if we have an excess demand? So if we are still allowing the market not to move to back to the equilibrium state when we have an excess demand, we have a shortage. Okay? Bakit shortage? Kasi nga, if the equilibrium price is 40, tapos the selling price would be 30, okay? Then that parang naiengganyo yung mga consumers na to buy more because mababa kasi yung presyo, di ba? So in that case, it would at that circumstances, it would create this shortage. So in this case, in the graph, this because at a low price, sellers are not that very happy. They're only selling 500 units at good X. Demanders, on their hand, they're quite happy, as you can see, because they're much more willing to purchase 1,200 units of good X. And within that, because there is this parang instability in terms of the goods that they want to buy and the goods that they want to sell, there is a shortage of 700 units of Codex. To address this predicament class, what will happen is, again, market forces would always move it back to the equilibrium by increasing the price to 40. Okay, this notion of moving back and forth to the equilibrium state is only allowed when there is no restrictions made by the government. So, eto na yung katagang sinasabi na let the market works for itself, because again, it would always go back to a state that is dictated by the forces in that model. Okay? Kasi nga, pag sinasabi na if the market works perfectly well, then government implementations or policies might distort the market in some ways. Okay? All right. Question, class, about what will happen if there is disequilibrium? All right. Okay, so this is already the general market equilibrium. Okay, so time check, it's 11:40. Should we start the discussion on the general market equilibrium? Sige. I think I'll just discuss na lang siguro the general parameters, and then we'll have a numerical example later on. Siguro sa Friday na. Okay. So, starting off the discussion on general market equilibrium, in most cases, this tells us that the price of one good might affect, or the demand and supply of one good would be affected if in terms of the other good. So what the relationship being established here is that what goods are. For example, complements ba, substitute ba, or no relationship at all. Now, in our review, what do we mean by substitute goods, and what's an example? And also, what are complementary goods, and what is an example? I'll call people Benavides. What's an example of a substitute good, or what's a substitute good first? And what are examples? Benavides. Yes, Ramos is raising her hand. Go ahead, Ramos. Maingay daw sa kanilang Benavides. So, Ramos, yes, take it away. What's an example of a substitute good? Or first, what is a substitute good? And what are examples?
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, hello?
Substitute goods are two goods that can be used in place of one another. So, for
Mhm.
example po yung sa soft drinks po, kunwari po, parang mas mahal yung Coke kaysa sa Pepsi. So, I would take the Pepsi na lang po. Since same naman po silang soft drinks, so doon na lang po ako sa mas mura.
So you're taking Pepsi and Coke as substitutes, correct? All right. Thank you. Yes, Asuncion. What do we mean by complements, and what are examples?
Hello po.
Yes.
Narinig po. Okay po.
Yes.
Complementary goods. There are the goods that adds value to one another, like
Mhm.
kape at coffee mate, ganun. Parang lagi silang magpartner. At
Sorry, what was that? Coffee mate and?
kape po.
Okay. Coffee. Coffee and coffee mate.
Opo.
Well,
Ayun.
technically, for wordplay, they're coffee mates.
Yes, ma'am. Tama po.
All right.
Ayun.
Okay.
Like ganun po.
Okay, thank you. So, in this class, in this quite a simple model, we can, however, tell that the goods are complements and substitutes. Although there are other ways when there are other more sophisticated ways of knowing if these two goods are complements and substitute complements and substitutes in the form of the concept of elasticity. But in this case, just you by using two linear models, then we can still look at if they're complements and substitutes. Okay, so in our general examples here, general parameters, we have two commodities that might be related to one another, because again, in some cases, they might not be related at all. So in parametric terms, the model can be written as this way. So best to note, class, to look at the subscripts here. So this tells us that again, say for example, for the demand of the demand function of the first commodity, we know that this would be dependent on the prices of one good and also the prices of the second good. Okay. The supply function here of the first commodity tells us that it also is dependent on the price of the first good, the price of its own good, or the price of the other good, or the price of the second good. For the third one here, this tells us as well that the demand of the second good is also dependent on the prices of the other good, which is the first good, and its own price or the second price. And also do this, and also the same for the supply function of the second good. It's dependent on the first price or the other price, and also its own price and the second price. Okay. We also have to make it more simpler. I don't think it would be simpler, but yeah, to help us with the analysis, we're using coefficients here, A and B, to to per- to pertain to the demand and supply functions of the first commodity. Alpha and beta here are used as coefficients that are assigned to those of the second commodity here. So Okay. Now, in usual practice class, we can first eliminate some variables here. So because we have 4 equations, we can reduce that one into 2 equations. So the first thing that we will do, the first and second here, we can eliminate that one. And also, this equation and also this equation here. Okay. So I think you can review the process later. But then again, what I'm doing is that we are substituting, or no, we're eliminating. Okay. This equation with here and this equation here. With what condition? With this condition here. Okay. So we're using this equation, and we substitute it here. Okay. And when using that, we eliminate it into two equations. Okay. Now, there is because we're dealing with 12 parameters here, although we have already classified that alpha and beta would be for good 2, A and B would for good be for good 1, it would somehow appear to be still complicated because ang daming parameters that we would be involving with. So we will be using a shorthand symbol, or we'll be defining a shorthand. So we have developed some shorthand symbols to connote also Mm, I think what I did here is to go directly to the shorthand symbols class. But again, we all know that we can still simplify this. Okay, and you come up with again 2 solutions. Okay, so I think what I did here is that I went there. I did not simplify it first. So you can first simplify it and then introduce a shorthand way of writing it. Okay. And then based on that, based on the simplified here, you can introduce this shorthand symbols. Then after which you can isolate both of the symbols, and by isolating will arrive with you'll arrive with this equation here. The next thing to do is to isolate P2, because you would be substituting P2 into the second equation. Okay, so I think what did I use here? Let me just correctly verify. Yeah. First, I isolate P2 here. So isolating P2 would mean all the other coefficients would be on the right hand side of the equation. And so you will arrive with this equation here. With P2 class isolated already, we have a value for P2 expressed in terms of parameters. We will substitute this one to our second equation. Okay, and with that, we can get the value for P1 star. And you have the P1 star, you have the value for P2 star. Okay, so you might want to review this one later and try to do the exercise. Okay, but one thing siguro that we did here was just to introduce a shorthand way of solving or writing to simplify the parameters, but the process are just the same. Okay, here are some restrictions that was imposed in the model. The denominator should not be 0, and it should also not be negative. Okay, and also it must have the same sign as the denominator. Okay, I think I'll end my discussion class on the general parametric terms before I proceed later on to the numerical example. Do we have a question? When we're I think this in comparison to the general parametric terms in the partial market equilibrium class, that the first one is easier the first one is quite easier to parang to solve or to compute. In this case, what it tends to get complicated just because of the parameters. But then again, the process is just the same. What is easier class when we're dealing with a general market equilibrium is when it's involved already with numerical coefficients. I think it's quite easier actually, especially when we've introduced already um, with the specific examples. So, but then again, let's not get overwhelmed lang siguro on this is how it's described in terms of the general parametric terms, because again, the process is just the same. Okay. Do we have a question?